Arab executive breaks down in tears as African Maid begs for this one thing he was known for: his ruthless business deals, billion-dollar mergers, and cold, unreadable face. A man who built his empire on precision, logic, and zero emotion. But when a humble African woman who had served silently in his mansion for over 8 years fell to her knees and made a plea that shattered every wall he'd ever built, he did something no one thought he was capable of. He cried. What, she asked. For wasn't money, nor power. It was something deeper. Something that touched a place inside him he thought was long dead. And what followed changed both of their lives forever in a way no one could have imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring you more powerful and inspiring stories like this one. In the glittering towers of downtown Dubai, where the skyline shimmered like polished gold, there was one office suite that stood higher both in height and in power. It belonged to Faris Al-Mansur, a 45-year-old Arab executive whose name was carved into every major contract in the Gulf region. From luxury resorts to high-speed rail projects, Faris controlled them all. He walked with the certainty of a man who owned his world. But behind that marble and glass empire was a truth no one dared to explore. Faris lived completely alone. No wife, no children, not even close friends. Just silence, servants, and an empire. Among those servants was Ao, African woman who had worked in Faris's household for over 8 years. She was quiet, efficient, and invisible by design. She never spoke unless spoken to, never rested until the last light in the mansion was turned off, and never complained. In a palace where luxury poured from every faucet, Ao slept in a tiny room with no window and sent every dirham she earned back to her village in Nigeria. She'd been more than a housekeeper. She was the one who watched over the marble floors that Faris's imported Italian shoes touched each morning. The one who brewed his tea to exactly 75 degrees, as he liked it. The one who replaced the flowers in his mother's old bedroom, though he never entered it anymore. To Faris, she was part of the structure. Like the curtains or the chandeliers present, reliable but not human. At least that was true until the morning everything cracked. It began like any other day. The city buzzed below, helicopters sliced through the sky, and Faris stood before his floor-to-ceiling windows checking global stock prices. Ao was in the corner of the living room, polishing a tray when she suddenly stopped moving. Her hand trembled. Then she placed the tray down gently, carefully, as if she were placing down a memory too heavy to carry. Faris turned slightly, catching her in his peripheral vision. Is something wrong with the tray? He asked, not looking at her fully. No, sir, she said, voice soft. Then, without any further hesitation, she stepped forward, took a breath, and knelt to the floor. Her knees touched the cold marble, and her eyes, tired, honest, filled with quiet fire, lifted to meet his. Please, sir, she said, I need to ask you something. I know I am just staff. I know I am not supposed to ask anything personal, but I have no one else. Faris froze. He turned slowly. The silence between them stretched like the desert heat, outside, still, and full of unseen weight. What is it? He asked, his tone colder than he intended. Not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort. No one in his staff ever asked him for anything beyond more cleaning fluid or shift changes. No one ever looked at him like that, with both fear and desperation burning behind their gaze. Ao's voice cracked as she spoke. My daughter is dying. In Nigeria, she needs an operation. I've sent every coin I have, but it's not enough. I didn't want to beg. I tried to be proud, but there is no more time. Her hands trembled now. Please, I need help. Faris didn't speak. His heart, buried under years of boardrooms and deals, didn't know how to process what he was feeling. He looked at this woman, this fixture of his home, who had never once broken the rules, and saw, for the first time, not a servant, but a mother. A desperate mother whose world was unraveling while she folded his linen napkins with perfect creases. The room was heavy, and Faris felt something move in his chest. Something foreign. It wasn't pity. It was deeper. Like recognition. Memory. You have a daughter? He said slowly, as if trying to confirm it to himself. Yes, Ao whispered. Her name is Lamy. She's only 13. She was born with a heart defect. Doctors say she needs surgery immediately. I've done everything I could, but it's not enough. I was going to leave today, go back to her. Even if it meant losing this job. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. She wasn't ashamed. For a moment, Faris thought of his own mother. The last time he saw her alive, she was holding her chest, breathing heavy, asking him to sit with her. He didn't. He had a meeting, and by the time he returned, she was gone. His throat tightened. Without realizing it, his hands curled into fists, then slowly relaxed. He stepped forward, just once. And in that moment, something broke. Faris Al-Mansur, the man who once made an oil tycoon cry in a boardroom, dropped to one knee. He looked into Ao's eyes and felt his own burn. Where is she? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ao blinked. Kano, Nigeria. Book a jet, he said, standing. You'll fly there tonight. And your daughter Shay, get the best heart surgeon in Africa. Whatever it takes. Ao gasped. And then, to her shock and to his own, Faris turned his face away, and wiped his eyes. A tear had fallen. "Get up, Io," he whispered. "You're not just staff, not anymore." She didn't speak. She simply stood, her legs trembling, heart pounding with a hope she hadn't felt in years, and as the city roared on outside, something silent but enormous shifted inside that room. Neither of their lives would ever be the same again. The private jet hummed steadily as it cut through the clouds on its way to Kano. Ao sat rigidly in the cream leather seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She wore the same uniform she always had, light blue cotton. Simple shoes, but, tonight, it felt like another person's clothes. Across from her sat Ferris Almancer, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, but his thoughts far from any spreadsheet or financial report. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The interior of the jet was elegant but understated. Gold-trimmed fixtures, polished mahogany paneling, and fresh white orchids on the table between them. Yet none of that registered for Ao. Her mind was fixed on one thing, her daughter's weak heartbeat, the panic in Lami's last voice message, the way she said, "Mama, I'm tired." She had expected Ferris to send her alone. That he even offered help was already beyond comprehension. But when he announced at the last minute that he would be accompanying her, she was stunned into silence. Not only had he chartered the flight, within hours, but he had also contacted a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon in Lagos, arranging for him to fly to Kano immediately. "Do you have someone waiting at the hospital?" Ferris asked suddenly, pulling her back to the present. Ao nodded. "My cousin Adama, she's been looking after Lami while I've been away." Ferris nodded once. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes had softened since the morning. He was not a man accustomed to traveling for anything but profit. This was different. This was personal, and that frightened him more than he cared to admit. "Tell me about her," he said after a pause. Ao blinked. "My daughter." Ferris nodded. Ao exhaled slowly, trying to find her voice. "She's the bravest girl I know. Always smiling, even when it hurt. She draws pictures of a house with a red door. That's what she wants someday. A home of our own. She likes mangoes. She always asks me to bring some when I come back from the city." Her voice broke. "I never got the chance to." Ferris leaned back in his seat, fingers intertwined. His chest felt heavy. For years he'd taught himself to separate emotion from decision, but tonight, that boundary blurred. He wasn't sure why her story reached so deep into him. Maybe it was the rawness in her voice. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood, lonely, rigid, shaped by duty and silence. He looked out the window. Below them, the world stretched endlessly, dark and indifferent, but inside that jet, something sacred was unfolding. "You've been in my house for 8 years, Ferris said quietly. "I didn't even know your last name." "It's Okoye Ao," whispered. He nodded. "Ao Okoye." She looked down, unsure how to respond. "I'm ashamed of that," he added, not knowing, not asking. "You were never unkind," she said gently, "just distant." Ferris let out a breath, somewhere between a sigh and a confession. "I've spent my life building walls, Io. I didn't know how not to." The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing their descent into Kano. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm golden glow across their faces. Ao's stomach twisted with anticipation and fear. What if they were too late? What if Lami was already gone? The wheels touched down with a soft thud. A black SUV waited on the tarmac, engine running, driver ready. As soon as the door opened, Ferris gestured for Ao to go first. They drove in silence through the winding streets of Kano. The city was alive with neon signs and motorcycles, but Ao barely noticed. Her fingers gripped the seatbelt, her prayers whispered beneath each breath. When they arrived at the hospital, Ao ran through corridors, past nurses, until she reached room 214. She burst through the door. There she was. Lami, tiny, thin, pale, her chest rising faintly, an oxygen mask on her face, and beside her, Adama stood up in shock. "Mama," Lami whispered, eyes fluttering open. Ao dropped to her knees at the bedside. "I'm here, baby, I'm here." Ferris remained at the doorway. He had seen many things in his life: wars, bankruptcies, betrayals, but nothing like this. A woman collapsing beside her dying child, love pouring out of her like a river finally freed. Ao held Lami's hand. "Help is here, my love. You're going to get better." The surgeon arrived within minutes. Everything moved quickly after that. Tests, scans, preparations. Ferris handled it. All payments, permissions, logistics. He didn't ask for thanks. He just moved, like a man possessed by something greater than himself. As the doctors wheeled Lami away for surgery, Io turned to Ferris, her eyes swollen with tears, lips trembling. "I have nothing to give you," she whispered. "You did," Ferris said. She frowned. "You gave me something I didn't know I was missing," he said. "A reason to feel." And with that, he stepped beside her, watching as the doors closed behind the surgical team, carrying a fragile girl with a heart still full of hope. The corridor outside the operating room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the linoleum floor. Io sat on the edge of a plastic chair, her fingers locked tightly around a worn rosary. Ferris stood nearby, arms crossed, leaning against the wall in a silence that felt heavier than the air around them. The surgeons had said the procedure could take hours. Neither of them moved. The moments passed like slow drops of water in a leaky faucet. Tick, tick, tick. AAO had long stopped crying. She had cried on the plane, cried when she saw her daughter's chest barely rising beneath the oxygen mask, cried again when the nurses took Lami out of her arms and through the double doors. Now, there was nothing left but waiting and a fragile hope wrapped in fear. Ferris glanced at her. In this dim, clinical space, she looked smaller somehow, weary but not weak, never weak. He had built towers out of ambition and contracts, but the strength in this woman's silence surpassed all of it. He didn't know what moved him more, the child's frailty or the mother's fierce love. I haven't been to a hospital since my father died, he said quietly, surprising himself. Ao looked up, eyes still glistening. I'm sorry. Ferris nodded, his gaze fixed on the corridor. He was a hard man, like me, I suppose. No softness, just discipline and success. He believed love was a distraction. His jaw tensed. When my mother passed, he didn't shed a tear, just poured himself another drink and said, life keeps moving. Ao shifted slightly. And what did you believe? Ferris paused for a long moment. I believed him. There was pain in his voice, buried deep, but unmistakable. I buried my feelings. Under buildings and money, he added. Until tonight, I thought I had done the right thing. Ao offered a small, knowing smile. It takes strength to build empires, but more to rebuild a heart. He turned to her then. How do you carry so much pain and still have kindness in you? She looked at him gently. Because I never stopped believing in joy, even when it felt far away. Ferris felt something shift inside him again. Not a collapse, but an opening. The double doors swung open with a metallic groan. A nurse appeared, her face tight but calm. She made it through the surgery, the woman said. The next 24 hours will be critical, but the procedure was a success. Ao gasped, then exhaled like she'd been underwater for weeks. Can I see her? She asked, her voice trembling. Soon, she's being moved to recovery now. The nurse nodded. Ao turned to Ferris, but no words came, just a flood of silent gratitude in her eyes. She reached for his hand uncertainly at first, but he took it without hesitation, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not romance, not duty, something purer, a shared humanity, recognition. Later that night, they sat side by side in the recovery room, watching Lami sleep. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, but her face was peaceful. Her chest rose and fell with quiet strength. Ferris had never sat so long without checking his phone. Not once did he open his email. Not once did he think about his next deal. Instead, he watched Ao stroke her daughter's hair, whispering songs in her native Yoruba. He didn't understand the words, but the melody itself seemed to cradle the child. It reminded him of something he had long forgotten, his mother humming to him before bed, back when his world was still small and full of softness. Ao looked up. Thank you for staying. Ferris smiled faintly. I didn't want to leave. You didn't have to do any of this, she said, but I needed to, he replied. She tilted her head, curious. I always thought my legacy would be the towers I built, he said. But maybe it's the lives I touch. Maybe that's what matters. In the end, Ao's eyes welled again. It does. It always has. The next morning, Ferris called off his meetings. His assistant was shocked. He told her he'd be working remotely, then hung up and turned off the phone again. He sent one message only, to a private banker, instructing him to create a medical fund under Lami Okoye's name, ensuring she would never lack for care again. The following days, Ferris didn't just support the family, he became part of their world. He met Ao's extended relatives, dined on traditional jollof rice under a flickering light bulb, and held Lami's hand when she finally opened her eyes, and smiled faintly at him. You're the man from Mama's dreams, she whispered once. Ferris blinked, unsure how to answer. I'm just a friend, he said softly. No, she whispered again. You're more? And maybe she was right, because for the first time in his life, Ferris didn't feel like a ruler looking down at the world, but a man who had finally come home to his heart. A week had passed since the surgery, and Lami was recovering faster than the doctors had predicted. Her color had returned, her voice had grown stronger, and most miraculously, the brightness in her eyes had come back. The nurses adored her, and even the stern head doctor smiled every time she called him uncle. With that cheeky little grin of hers, Ferris remained in Kano. He was still staying in the modest hotel near the hospital, ignoring the puzzled emails from investors and associates who couldn't understand why their most powerful partner had gone silent. For once, he didn't care. The world could wait. Every morning he visited the hospital with a bag of mango salami's favorite. Every evening, he returned alone to his room, his head full of conversations, laughter, and questions he had never thought he'd ask himself. What if I had a daughter? What if I'd lived a different life? Ao watched him carefully. She noticed the way he sat on the edge of Lami's bed, how his hand lingered on hers a second longer, how he listened when she spoke about cartoons or the red-doored house of her dreams. It was during one of these visits that Ao took a deep breath and made a decision that both terrified and empowered her. Mr. Ferris, she said softly, as he peeled a mango for Lami. He looked up. You don't have to call me that anymore, she smiled. but there was something serious behind her eyes. Then, Ferris, she corrected, I wanted to ask something of you. He raised an eyebrow. Anything. I'd like to invite you to my home, she said gently. My real home, the one I left when I came to work for you, my village. Ferris hesitated. She went on, her voice steady. You've done so much for us, but I want you to understand where we come from. I want you to see who we are, not just the people who work in shadows, but the people who love, and build, and survive. Ferris didn't answer immediately. It was unlike anything he'd ever been asked. He was used to being protected, guided through first-class lounges and chauffeured cars. The idea of visiting a rural African village on foot, perhaps, or by dirt road, was not part of his world, but this woman, who had once been invisible in his own mansion, now stood before him as someone he respected, trusted, admired. He nodded. Slowly, yes, I'd like that. 2 days later, they made the journey. It was long, bumpy, and nothing like Ferris had ever experienced. There were no paved roads, no five-star accommodations, just red dust, open skies, and the occasional herd of goats crossing the path. When they arrived, children came running barefoot, shouting Lami's name. Ayo's cousin Adama had already returned ahead of them, spreading the news that the girl who almost died was coming home with a miracle, and beside her was the man who made it happen. Ferris stepped out of the car, unsure of what to expect. But what he received was not formality or reverence, it was warmth, a warmth he hadn't felt in decades. Hands clasped his ingratitude. Elders greeted him with soft nods. Women offered food, stories, laughter. He was given a chair under a tree, and Lami sat beside him, proudly showing him every drawing she had made during her hospital stay. In each one, she had drawn a little red door. She believes in it like a fairy tale, Ayo said, laughing. Ferris stared at the drawing for a moment, then asked, Why red? She says red means life, Ayo said, and it's the color of her favorite dress. That night, Ferris couldn't sleep. He walked through the quiet paths of the village, the stars above him far clearer than in Dubai's haze. For the first time, he felt something unshakable blooming inside him. Not guilt, not charity, not a sense of belonging. This wasn't just Ayo's village anymore. It was part of his story now too, and though he didn't say it yet, the idea had already taken root. He would build her that house. With the red door, no matter what it took. Ferris stood quietly on the edge of the clearing, watching the village stir to life in the early morning haze. Roosters crowed in the distance, smoke drifted lazily from cooking fires, and barefoot children darted between clay huts, chasing each other with the joyful recklessness only youth could afford. He was still dressed in his usual tailored slacks and white linen shirt, but here, among these people, and this land, he felt unarmored like a man stripped of title, status, and reputation. Ayo's invitation had done more than bring him to a village. It had broken something open inside him, and that something wouldn't let go. Lami sat cross-legged on a woven mat nearby, humming softly to herself as she colored another picture. Her latest creation was different. This one showed a big house, made of stone and wood, with flowers on the windows and, of course, a bright red door at the center. Ferris knelt beside her. You draw that red door a lot, he said, his voice gentle. Lam. I nodded, eyes shining. It's where I imagine we'll live one day. Mama and me, and maybe even you, she added shyly. Ferris blinked. He had no words. Ayo approached from behind, a basket in her hands. She caught his eye and smiled. She thinks you're a hero. I'm not, he murmured. You are to her. They sat under the baobab tree where they'd first arrived, Lami and Ferris with the village, moving around them like a quiet symphony. There was peace here, not the sterile quiet of his penthouse, but a warmth born of community, of shared history and everyday struggle. That afternoon, Ferris asked Ayo to walk with him. They wandered beyond the houses, toward the river, where the air smelled of wet earth and the breeze carried laughter from unseen places. It was there, watching the sun shimmer on the water, that Ferris turned to her with eyes more serious than she'd ever seen. I want to build you that house. Ayo froze. I mean it, he said. A real home, right here. For you and Lami. With a red door. Ferris, I can't explain this feeling, he said, voice low. But I know I don't want to leave this village without leaving something behind. Something that matters. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why us? He looked at her for a long time. Because you made me remember. I have a soul. Ayo's throat tightened. Her whole life she had expected people to overlook her, pass her by, treat her kindness as service and her silence as emptiness. But this man, this billionaire, had seen her, not just her struggle, but her worth. Thank you, she whispered. That evening he gathered the village elders beneath the same baobab tree. He told them his intention respectfully, clearly, and without arrogance. I don't want to disrupt your ways, he said, but I'd like to build a home here, for Ayo and Lami, not a palace, just something safe, lasting with your blessing. The elders exchanged looks. One of them, an old man with white brows, and a voice like gravel, spoke. Men, like you come through here, sometimes, he said, but they take pictures, they give speeches, then they leave. I'm not here for that, Ferris said calmly. The elder studied him. And what are you here for? Ferris looked toward the small hut where Lami now slept. To make a promise, real. And so, with a nod and a slow smile, the elder extended his hand. Then build your house, Mr. Almancer. Let the door be read. Construction began within the week. Ferris stayed in Kano to oversee the project personally. He didn't call in corporate architects or import marble from Italy. Instead, he hired local builders, listened to village input, and insisted every part of the house reflect Ao's roots. The foundation was laid with bricks fired just outside the village. The roof was designed to stay cool in the intense heat. Io chose the tiles herself, while Lami picked flowers for the garden every morning, imagining what colors would match her door. And when the moment finally came 3 months later, stood before the finished house with tears in his eyes. It was simple, elegant, and full of life. A red door glowed in the center, surrounded by hand-carved patterns made by local artisans. Wind chimes danced in the breeze, and in the backyard, a swing hung from the branch of a mango tree. The village gathered for the unveiling. Music filled the air, women danced, and children clapped. Ao wore a white dress, Lami wore red. Ferris handed them the key himself. I've never given anything in my life without expecting something in return, he admitted. But this is for you? Ao took the key slowly, then reached up and embraced him, not as a servant thanking a master, but as a woman thanking a man who had chosen to change. Ferris didn't resist. He closed his eyes and let the embrace wash over him. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace, not because he had acquired something, but because he had given something that truly mattered. Not money, not charity, but dignity and love. Life in the village settled into a gentle rhythm. The house with the red door quickly became more than a home, it became a symbol. Children would pass by just to touch the smooth wood. Neighbors came with baskets of fruit, and elders occasionally sat under the mango tree in the backyard, as if its shade carried something sacred. Now, Io had never known this kind of peace. She woke each morning to the sound of birds, Lami's laughter echoing through the garden, and the warmth of a home that wasn't borrowed or temporary but hers. She had grown used to instability, to working in silence, to living in service, but now she lived in presence. In dignity, Ferris surprisingly remained close, though he had returned briefly to Dubai for business. He was back within weeks, with no press coverage, no entourage, and no boardroom urgency. He stayed in the village, for days at a time, his expensive suits replaced by cotton shirts and rolled-up sleeves. He helped with the school's repairs, offered to fund new water tanks, and even taught Lami how to play chess beneath the baobab tree. One evening, after a quiet dinner of rice and fried plantains, Ao found Ferris sitting alone near the garden. The sky was painted in gold and amber, and the scent of earth lingered in the air. She sat beside him. You don't owe us anything else, Ferris, she said gently. He looked at her, thoughtful. It's not about owing. Then what is it? He hesitated, then said, I feel more myself here than I do in any boardroom. That should scare me, but it doesn't. Ao tilted her head. You've changed. He nodded, or maybe I just stopped pretending. A pause. Then she asked, quietly, what are you going to do now? It was the question he'd been circling for weeks. He stared at the horizon. I thought I had everything, and in a way, I did. But none of it meant anything. Not until this. Not until you. She looked down, heart pounding. I came to help, he continued, but I ended up needing this more than I ever realized. Io didn't speak. Her hands folded gently in her lap. She had feelings for him, yes, growing quietly in the corners of her heart, but she didn't trust fantasy. Life had taught her to be cautious, to never expect dreams to come true. But then Ferris turned toward her. Io, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Come with me. She blinked. What? Not as a servant, not as staff, as a partner. I'm returning to Dubai for a while, but I want you and Lami with me. I want to help raise her, support her, and I want you by my side, as someone I trust, someone I care for. Ao's breath caught. She shook her head slightly, overwhelmed. Ferris, we're from different worlds. Maybe, he said, but that doesn't mean we can't choose each other. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a romantic outburst under the moon. It was an offer, genuine, steady, deeply real. He didn't promise her luxury or magic. He promised her space beside him. A voice, a future. I won't take you away from this life you've rebuilt, he said. But if you ever want something more, something new, I want you to know, you're welcome. Ao looked at the red door, in the distance, then at the man beside her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel beneath someone's gaze. She felt seen, equal. She reached out, took his hand gently, and said, Give me time. Ferris nodded. And there, in the soft silence of a shared sunset, two lives once impossibly far apart began to draw closer, with no rush, no demand, just choice, just truth. And behind them, the house with the red door stood as quiet witness to it all. Months passed, seasons shifted, markets surged, and cities pulsed, with new ambitions, but the small village where Ao and Lami lived remained steady. The house with the red door became not only a symbol of kindness, but a quiet legend. Strangers came to see it. Journalists tried to write about it, but Ferris had made one thing clear: this wasn't for the press. This wasn't for show, this was real. Ferris had returned to Dubai, but something had changed in him permanently. His penthouse still stood, his offices still buzzed with urgency. But now, the walls bore photographs, not of construction sites and luxury hotels but of Lamy, smiling beside her mother under a mango tree. His assistant, Layla, noticed the difference. "You don't pace anymore," she said one morning. "I don't have to," Ferris replied with a calm she had never seen. Before, he spent his days differently now. He launched a new foundation, the Red Door Initiative, focused on rural infrastructure, maternal health care, and education across Africa. It was Ayo's influence that shaped the pillars of that mission. Quietly, and without fanfare, Ferris funneled his wealth into places that needed it most. Places like the one that had healed his soul. But it wasn't just money that he gave. He wrote letters. Long ones to Ayo. At first they came once a week, then twice, sometimes 3 in the same day. They were always handwritten, elegant penmanship on thick paper, sealed with wax. In them, he didn't speak of markets or mergers. He spoke of longing, of transformation, of how he would sometimes wake in the night, imagining her voice, the scent of wood smoke, the sound of Lamy's laughter. Ayo kept each one in a wooden box by her bed. She never wrote back, not yet. But every evening she read them again, sometimes aloud to Lamy, who by now called Ferris uncle without hesitation. One morning, a school was inaugurated in the village, built with funds from the Red Door Initiative. It was the first structure of its kind within 100 kilometers. Painted white, with red trim, it featured a library, clean restrooms, and electricity powered by solar panels. Ayo stood at the podium that day, wearing the same white dress from the house's unveiling. "We used to be invisible," she said to the gathered crowd. "We lived quiet lives. We worked, we prayed, and we hoped someone out there would see us. And then, one man did. But not just as a charity case. He saw our strength. He honored it. And because of that, my daughter lives. And now, our children will learn." Lamy was the first student to enter the new classroom. She wore a red headband, her curls bouncing, and on her desk sat a single mango, her lucky charm. 2 weeks later, Ferris returned. He arrived without security, without a convoy, just one suitcase and a gift under his arm. The village welcomed him, like family. Children ran beside him, women brought him bowls of rice, and the elders greeted him like a son returning home. Ayo stood at the edge of the garden. When she saw him step out of the car, he was thinner, his eyes more tired, but he smiled in a way she hadn't seen before, soft, unburdened. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to." She looked at him, eyes full of warmth. "You never left, Ferris." "Not really." That night, under the baobab tree, they sat again. But this time, there was no distance between them, no formality, just a silence full of meaning. "I brought something for Lamy," he said, handing her the gift. Ayo unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a children's book. The title was in English, Arabic, and Yoruba, The House with the Red Door. Ayo opened it. The pages were illustrated in watercolor. The story was simpler: mother and daughter who built a home with love, and a traveler who had forgotten how to feel until he met them. She flipped to the final page. There, in bold, elegant handwriting, were the words, "To Lamy Soyul. Always remember that love builds more than houses. It builds hearts." Ayo's hands trembled. "You wrote this?" "I had help," Ferris admitted. "A friend of mine in publishing made it happen. I wanted her story to live on." Ayo was silent for a moment, then looked up at him. "You're not just a man who changed his ways," she said. "You're a man who learned how to live." Ferris looked down. "And I don't want to live without you." She froze. "I meant what I said months ago," he continued. "But this time, I'm not offering charity. I'm asking for partnership, for a family, if you'll have me." Ayo blinked. I want to build a new life. With you. With Lamy. Wherever you choose to be." Tears welled in her eyes. "You're not scared. I've faced billion-dollar losses, but nothing scared me more than the thought of never seeing you again." Lamy ran up to them then, holding her new book. "Mama, look, it's me." Ferris lifted her onto his lap, and she leaned into him without hesitation. Ayo watched the two of them, and in that moment, she knew her answer. "Yes," she said. Not because it was a fairy tale, but because it was real, earned, deserved. Weeks later, they married in a simple ceremony under the baobab tree. No journalists, no headlines, just family, friends, and one red door in the distance, catching the sun like a promise kept. And as Ferris held Ayo's hand, and Lamy clutched her mother's skirt, the man who once lived in glass towers finally understood the meaning of legacy. Not in marble, not in gold, but in the eyes of a child who lived, in the arms of a woman who taught him to feel, and in a village where one red door changed everything. Ferris Almanzar was not the kind of man who used to linger. He had built a life out of sharp decisions and fast exits, an empire raised from the quicksand of doubt by simply refusing to sink. There was a time when he believed that detachment was the cost of greatness, That emotional restraint was the armor that separated the visionaries from the ordinary. But that was before a quiet woman named Ao Okoye fell to her knees in his living room and asked not for luxury, not for status, but for her child's life. Now, months after that moment, Ferris found himself sitting barefoot outside a home made of clay, wood, and soul, watching the sun rise beyond fields of cassava and maize, his toes buried in the red dirt. Lami was inside, humming a tune as she organized her school bag. Ao was out at the garden, picking fresh mint for tea. And Ferris, he was doing something he had never known how to do before. Nothing, and he was at peace. The house with the red door had become more than a promise. It had become a center of gravity. When Ferris walked through the village now, people no longer whispered billionaire or foreign investor. They said brother, they said family, they said the one who stayed. That morning Ferris rose slowly and walked down the dusty path to the school that now bore his foundation's name. The Red Door School had grown quickly, not just in student numbers, but in spirit. Walls once blank were now covered in colorful hand-painted murals. Ao had helped lead the effort, working with teachers to make sure each child received not just education but respect. Inside the headmaster's office, Ferris sat with a woman named Omolara, a sharp-witted former university lecturer who had returned from Lagos to lead the school. We're getting letters from other villages, she told him, sipping hot tea. They want schools too, clinics, water systems. They want what this place has become. Ferris nodded. Then we'll build more. She paused, eyeing him. You sure you're not running from something? He smiled. I'm running toward something good, she said, because you're not just funding this now, you're part of it. He knew that already. What he hadn't expected was how deeply he would care about it all. He found himself looking forward to school plays, to garden harvests. 2 evenings spent reviewing logistics for the next borehole installation with villagers who'd once been strangers. He even started learning Yoruba not out of necessity, but respect at night. He sat with Ao under the stars. They didn't always speak. They didn't have to. Ao wasn't like the women from the polished circles of Dubai. She didn't need to fill the silence. Her presence was grounding. Every now and then, she would read his old letters back to him, the ones he wrote during his time away. It embarrassed him at first how exposed he'd let himself be on paper, but Ao always smiled and said, "This is the man I fell in love with." One day, Lamy came home from school unusually quiet. Ao noticed at first. "Baby, what's wrong?" Lamy looked down at her hands. "Someone said I shouldn't live in a big house if I'm not rich." Ferris's chest tightened. He crouched beside her. "Who said that?" "It doesn't matter," she said softly. He paused. "Lamy, being rich doesn't mean having money. It means having safety, and people who love you. This house wasn't built because of wealth. It was built because of a promise." She looked up at him, tears pooling. "But why me?" Ferris swallowed. "Because you matter, because you're alive, and because when your mother begged me to save you, it woke something inside me I didn't even know was asleep." Io wrapped her arms around Lamy, and the three of them stood there, in the middle of the hallway, holding each other like a family that had been tested and come through stronger. That night, Ferris sat at his desk and began drafting a new plan. A chain of Red Door schools, not franchised, not corporate, but each rooted in partnership with the villages they served. Each tailored, each built with local materials, local labor, and local leadership. He called it Project Second Sun, named after Lamy's nickname for the sunrise the day she left the hospital weeks later. At the official launch of the second school in a nearby district, Ferris stood before a gathering of nearly 200 people. He wore a simple white tunic, nothing grand, no tie, no bodyguards. He told them about his old life, how he used to measure success by the height of his buildings, how he thought compassion was weakness, how he once stepped over suffering because he'd been told success was stepping past, and how one voice, one trembling plea had changed the course of his legacy forever. People wept, not because the speech was dramatic, but because it was true. That night, a group of young men approached him, asking to intern with his foundation, not for salary, just to learn, to contribute. They called him Sir, but he asked them to use his first name. Ferris was no longer a name that needed to stand above. It was a name that could stand among. Months became a year. One morning Lamy fell ill again. A cough at first, then fatigue, then difficulty breathing. Panic returned to Ao's chest. Like a phantom she thought she had outrun. Ferris stayed calm on the outside, but inside he was breaking. They rushed her to the clinic. The tests were inconclusive. The symptoms confusing. Malaria was ruled out. So was pneumonia. Days passed with little clarity. Then, on a humid afternoon, Ao walked into the exam room to find Ferris sitting beside Lamy's bed, holding her hand and reading her the book he had published. When he reached the part about the house with the red door, Lamy smiled faintly and whispered, "That's where I'll go if I don't wake up." Ferris's voice broke. "Lamy?" "No," he whispered, his lips trembling. "You built it for me," she said, "so I'll never be afraid." Tears streamed silently down his face. That evening, the doctors finally identified the illness, a rare post-surgical complication affecting her immune system, but it was treatable. Slowly, with care, she began to recover. Ferris didn't leave her bedside for 5 days. When she finally sat up and reached for his hand, he kissed her forehead like a father, not like a man who tried, like a man who belonged. Years later, the house with the red door was no longer just a symbol. It had become a pilgrimage. People came from across the continent to see where the story began. Ao, now managing director of the Red Door Foundation, gave speeches at universities. Lami grew into a poised, confident young woman, fluent in 3 languages, curious, kind, and unafraid of hard truths. And Ferris. He aged, his beard turned silver, he moved more slowly, but his spirit had only grown brighter. On his 60th birthday, Ao hosted a quiet dinner under the baobab tree. Friends came, villagers danced. Lami read a speech she had written without telling him. In it, she said, "You changed the world, not by raising towers, but by kneeling for the first time in your life. Not in weakness, but in love. I carry your name not because of what you've built, but because of what you gave up to build something better." That night, as fireflies blinked in the trees, Ferris sat beside Ao in silence once more, and when she leaned her head on his shoulder, he whispered, "I thought I would be remembered for my buildings." She smiled, "You will be, but not the kind made of steel." They looked out at the red door in the distance. It was weathered now, but still bright, still standing, still opening to anyone who believed that love could, in fact, change everything. Ferris Almanzar sat beneath the baobab tree as the wind moved gently through its old branches. The late afternoon light bathed the village in hues of bronze and gold, and in the distance, children played barefoot in the dust. It had been almost 20 years since he'd first arrived here, tense, confused, armored in silence. Now those years felt like a lifetime stitched together by moments of quiet bravery. His cane rested beside him, his breath was slower these days. His sharp posture had softened, but his eyes remained clear. As always, they faced the red door. The house had grown, not in size, but in soul. It was still made of clay and wood, but its windows were framed by creeping jasmine, and its garden overflowed with mint, mango, and wildflowers. Inside, photographs lined the walls. Ao teaching at a conference in Kenya, Lami graduating from university in South Africa, children from across the continent standing proudly beside schools funded by the Red Door Foundation. Each picture held a story. Each story began with one impossible moment, when a woman kneeled in silence, and a man remembered how to feel. Ao emerged from the house, her silver-streaked hair tied back, her face glowing with the same steady strength she had always carried. She held a cup of tea in one hand and a letter in the other. "You wrote again?" she said, smiling. "I did, for her." Ferris nodded. "For her and for myself." He took the letter and opened it slowly. His hands trembled now when he wrote, but the words still came with ease. He read it aloud, his voice low and warm. "My dearest Lami, you once asked me why I stayed, why a man who could buy anything chose to live among clay walls and mango trees. I didn't answer you properly. Then, I don't think I knew how. But now, as the years stretch long behind me and the sun sets slower in my eyes, I want you to know, I stayed because love changes you. I stayed because the day your mother fell to her knees was the day I stood up as a human being for the first time in decades. I stayed because in saving you, I found myself. You gave me a second chance at life. Not with fanfare, not with speeches, just with a quiet plea and a pair of eyes that held everything I'd forgotten: faith, family, courage. People will remember the schools, the clinics, the red doors that now stand in villages across Africa like flags planted in hope. But for me, my legacy is simpler. It is you. It is your voice, your laughter, your brilliance, your belief in a world that can be better. When I am no longer here, I want you to remember this. You were never saved out of pity. You were saved out of purpose, out of connection, out of a story that needed to be told, not with numbers or cement, but with humanity. If you ever doubt your place in the world, look at the red door, and know that everything behind it was built because of you. Love always." Ferris ***. Silence followed. Ao sat beside him, their hands brushing. "She still keeps the first one you ever gave her," she said softly. "The one you wrote from Dubai. She carries it when she travels." Ferris smiled. "She was always the strongest of us." He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where another school was being finished, a new one, in a new region, built by the next generation of Red Door leaders. Lami had taken over the foundation's direction 5 years ago, and under her vision, it had grown beyond any of their expectations. Refugee housing, maternal shelters, agricultural education, all of it rooted in the same principle: dignity. She had her father's eyes now, and her mother's fire. Later that night, the house was full. A small gathering, family, friends, elders, who had once stood skeptical at the idea of a billionaire building anything without strings, now sat laughing beside him, eating roasted maize and retelling old stories. Lami arrived late, still dressed in her work attire from a nearby conference. She kissed her father on the forehead, held his face in her hands, and whispered, "You look tired." "I am," he admitted, "but full." They sat on the porch together, looking out at the red door. "I remember when you painted it," she said. "You let me pick the color. Mama said red meant life." She was right. Ferris said. Red is the color of hearts still beating. Lami grew quiet. Do you ever wish you had done it sooner? Lived differently before? Ferris thought for a long moment. No, he said. Because every step I took, Evan, the wrong ones, led me to the moment that changed everything. And in the end, it's not how fast you wake up that matters. It's whether you do. She nodded. The wind shifted, and then, as if the world understood the timing, the first drops of rain began to fall. It was soft, almost melodic. The kind of rain that kissed the earth instead of punishing it. Ao joined them, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. Ferris wrapped an arm around her gently, and they sat together, all three, watching the water run down the red door like a baptism. It was in that moment, quiet and unassuming, that Ferris felt the final piece of his journey settle into place. No applause, no headlines, just love and legacy. In peace. 1 year later, Ferris passed away in his sleep beneath the same baobab tree where he had rediscovered his humanity. His funeral was held not in a marble hall, but in the village square. Thousands attended, from CEOs to school children. They came not for wealth, but for what he left behind. Lami gave the final eulogy. My father was a builder, she said, not of towers, but of people. He didn't save me, he believed in me, and that belief changed the world. Io stood beside her, holding the first letter he ever wrote. It was read aloud, and as the words danced through the air, the wind caught. The Maid carried them beyond the village, beyond the schools, across continents. They say, the house with the red door still stands, that even after storms and years of sun, its color remains bright, because it was never just paint. It was a promise that no one is too rich to care, no one is too far gone to return, and no life is too small to change everything. If this story touched your heart, remember, there are still red doors to be opened all around us. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Let's keep building legacies that matter, one act of courage at a time.